Entracte, toward an understanding of slower growth. The conclusion of Chapter 15 marks the transition from Part 2 to Part 3 of the book. We have now taken a closer look at the mixed record of progress, depicted in Chapters 10 through 15, from 1940 to 2014. Throughout the different dimensions of the growth experience, the decades since 1940 do not exhibit the same uniformity of revolutionary change as occurred between 1870 and 1940. Instead, the year 1970 marks a distinct breakpoint between faster and slower growth. The 10 decades between 1870 and 1970 deserve their accolade, awarded in Chapter 1 as the Special Century. The inventions of the Second Industrial Revolution, IR number 2, gathered momentum between 1870 and 1920, and then between 1920 and 1970, created the most rapid period of growth in labor productivity experienced in American history, bringing an utter change from 1870 in most dimensions of human life. The inventions of the Third Industrial Revolution, IR number 3, though revolutionary within their sphere of influence, entertainment, communication, and information technology, did not have the same effects on living standards as had electricity, the internal combustion engine, running water, improving life expectancy, and the other great inventions of the special century, not to mention the improvement in the human condition as work hours declined from 60 to 40 hours per week. By definition, growth in output per person equals growth in labor productivity plus growth in hours worked per person in the population. Starting in the late 1960s, there was a distinct slowdown in labor productivity growth. However, growth in output per person avoided suffering a similar slowdown until after 2000, because its growth rate exceeded that in labor productivity by the contribution of rising hours of work per person. This occurred as women shifted from housework to work in the market, meaning that each woman who made this shift raised average hours of market work for the population as a whole. Since 2000, we have seen a sharp decline in growth in output per person and its two components, growth in productivity and in hours of work per person, after corrections for the ups and downs of the business cycle. Because the basic data are unambiguous in registering a significant and deepening growth slowdown, the book's title, The Rise and Fall of American Growth, has become a statement of fact. We are now ready in Part 3 to explore some of the reasons why growth was so rapid during 1920 to 70 and why it has been slowing down since 1970. The mixed record of growth since 1970. The aggregate record across all sectors of the economy shows that productivity growth slowed down markedly after 1970 and experienced a brief revival during 1996 to 2004 that most analysts attribute to the influence of the invention of the web, search engines, and e-commerce, as well as to the sharp spike of investment in information and communication technology, ICT, equipment. In the past decade, productivity growth has been even slower than it was between 1970 and 1996. This story of slowdown, revival, and further slowdown, as told by the economy-wide data, conceals substantial differences in performance across sectors of economic activity. Among the sectors examined in the chapters of Part 2, Entertainment and Communication, Chapter 12, and Digital Equipment, Chapter 13, led the pack by exhibiting faster growth after 1970 than before. Between 1950 and 1970, broadcast TV was limited in choice to the three big commercial networks and public television, and there was little change beyond the arrival of color and larger screens. Innovation accelerated after 1970 with the explosion of choice made possible by cable and satellite TV, with time shifting made possible by the video cassette recorder and digital video recorder. and with rental followed subsequently by streaming of movie videos. Communication changed little until the breakup of the Bell telephone monopoly in 1983, after which accelerating change created ever smaller and more capable mobile phones, followed by the merger of the computer and the mobile phone in the form of the smartphone, introduced with the BlackBerry in 2003 and the iPhone in 2007. Compared to entertainment and communication, which continued enjoying rapid and steady progress to the present day, the progress of the digital revolution was more episodic. The third industrial revolution, IR number 3, based on personal computers, the web, and search engines, exhibited a pronounced peak in its effects on labor productivity during 1996 to 2004. And its driving force, Moore's Law, governing the increased density of computer chips, showed signs after 2005 of slowing down. At the other extreme from the fast growth exhibited by entertainment and ICT, innovations in the effects of food and clothing on the standard of living were minor. In the 70 years before 1940, food had experienced major change in the invention of processed food, the avoidance of contamination and adulteration, the benefits of refrigeration, and the rapid change in food marketing from the country store through stages to the modern supermarket, which began to spread in the 1930s. As described in Chapter 10, progress in food availability and marketing continued after 1940, but was relatively minor. More capable refrigerators allowed the 1916 invention of frozen food to become widely used, and there was a further increase in food variety, including out-of-season and organic produce. Rising prosperity allowed a major shift from the consumption of food at home to food away from home, creating food options from fast food outlets to pizza delivery to a wide range of upscale and downscale sit-down restaurants. Similarly, there was nothing after 1940 to compare with the pre-1940 shift as women became able to buy their own clothes instead of having to make them at home. Post-war changes in clothing involved mainly a shift in styles to more casual clothing and a shift from domestically produced to imported clothing that was substantially cheaper and that allowed the accumulation of wardrobes featuring more items. The theme of incremental progress following revolutionary change applies with force to the housing of the American family, which by 1940 in urban America had witnessed the nearly complete transition from the isolation of 1870 to the fully networked house, connected to the outside with electricity, gas, and telephone lines, as well as running water and waste disposal pipes. The end to hauling of pails of water, wood, and coal was among the most important advances in the human condition that had ever occurred, and it was almost complete in urban America by 1940. No change after 1940 compared with the networking revolution, except for the gradual arrival of each of the network components to small towns and farms in the decades between 1940 and 1970. A transition aided by a mass movement of households from farm to city. The big change in farm and city alike between 1940 and 1970 was the arrival of modern gas and electric appliances that ended housewife drudgery and created the modern kitchen that by 1970 looked much like today's kitchens, except for cosmetic touches and the ubiquitous microwave oven, a post-1970 arrival. Two changes were continuous throughout the post-war period, with no evident slowdown after 1970, and provided clear evidence of an ongoing rise in the standard of living. These were the steady increase in the size of newly constructed houses and the gradual conversion to air conditioning, first to room air conditioners initially sold in the early 1950s, and then to central air conditioning, which by 2010 had been installed in 2/3 of housing units. Chapter 11, on transportation, finds little improvement in travel by motor vehicle after 1970, a year by which most of the interstate highway system had been completed, replacing antiquated and dangerous roadways. Reduced motor vehicle fatality rates since 1970 have resulted mainly from government-mandated safety devices and improved roads. Though after 1970, automobiles did not change in their ability to move passengers and their cargo from points A to point B at a given speed, there was a steady increase in the quality of the automobiles making those journeys, thanks not only to safety devices, but also to convenience and comfort items, such as automatic transmission and air conditioning, as well as improved fuel economy. Our treatment of airline travel finds little improvement after 1970, a year when the conversion from piston to jet planes was complete. Along most dimensions, particularly seating comfort, meal service, and airport security, the quality of the air travel experience declined after 1970. Despite the promise of deregulation in 1978, the reduction in the relative price of air travel per mile flown was substantially slower during 1980 to 2000 than in 1950 to 80, and has been ever slower than that since 2000. Just as automobile fatality rates have experienced a steady decline with no hiatus after 1970, so too have airline fatality rates, which, since 2006, have fallen close to zero, thanks to better aircraft and engine design, improved air traffic control, and shifts in maintenance procedures. The evolution of medicine and physical health can be divided into three stages. The great achievement of the conquest of infant mortality had been largely completed by 1950, and the plague of infectious diseases had been conquered. As a result, the rate of improvement of life expectancy was twice as fast in the first half of the 20th century as in the second half. Progress, as chronicled in Chapter 14, shifted to a second stage after 1940 with the invention of antibiotics, particularly penicillin, and with the advance of knowledge in how to treat heart disease and cancer. Most of today's treatments for heart disease had been developed by the 1960s, and the incidence of cardiovascular diseases declined after reaching a peak in 1963. Radiation and chemotherapy treatments for cancer had also largely arrived in their present form by 1970. In the third stage, since 1970, life expectancy has continued to improve at a steady pace, albeit slower than before 1950, with a substantial contribution being made by the reduction in smoking, together with incremental improvements that increase survival rates from surgery. Senior citizens have benefited by the greater mobility in old age, made possible by widespread access to hip and knee replacement surgery. Conditions of work improved more slowly after 1940 than before. Nothing that happened after 1940 for the adult male worker compared to the reduction in the discomfort of physical labor made possible by shorter hours, more capable machinery, and the shift from farm to city. Nothing that happened after 1940 for the adult female housewife compared to the replacement of hauling of water, wood, and coal by the networked house, with its electricity, gas, telephone, water, and sewer connections. Nothing that happened after 1940 for male teenagers compared to the elimination of child labor and its replacement by universal high school education. And nothing that happened after 1940 was as important to the life of the older generation as the establishment in 1935 of Social Security, although the 1965 introduction of Medicare came close. The other dominant sources of progress of the post-war era, shared by citizens of all ages, have been the civil rights and voter legislation of 1964 to 65, the end of the Jim Crow regime of overt subjugation and segregation in the South, and, most important of all, the liberation of women, who flooded into the labor force after the mid-1960s. By 1980, women had become the majority of college students and had begun to enter the professions, most notably in medicine, but also significantly in law and business. The extent of output mismeasurement declined after 1970. A central theme of this book, previewed in Chapter 1 and summarized in the Entracte between Parts 1 and 2, is that official measures of real GDP fail to capture many aspects of the revolutionary changes that have occurred since 1870. Because real GDP is the numerator both of output per person and output per hour, this tendency of real GDP measures to understate progress implies that the growth rate of these key ratios has been systematically understated. The previous Entracte provided many examples of revolutionary changes between 1870 and 1940 in the standard of living that were missed by the real GDP data because no allowance is made for the value, consumer surplus, that consumers receive from newly invented products and services. Among the most important examples of improvements not valued in real GDP are the brightness, convenience, and safety of electric lights, the improved variety and reduced risk of food contamination, made possible by refrigeration, the removal of horse droppings and urine from city streets and rural highways as motor vehicles replaced horses, the dimensions of change in human activity made possible by the speed and carrying capacity of the motor vehicle and commercial aviation, the value of instant communication made possible by the telegraph and telephone, and the value of entertainment delivered by the invention of the phonograph, radio, and motion pictures. Some would place even more value on the arrival of clean running water that eliminated the previous drudgery of carrying water into and out of the home. The transition from the outhouse to the indoor toilet and bathroom, transition from child labor to high school education as the typical experience of teenage males, and perhaps, above all, the value of the reduction of infant mortality from 22% in 1890 to 1% in 1950. These changes, which provided immense value to all households, rich and poor alike, had arrived in urban America by 1940 and in farms and small towns by 1970. How did the understatement of real GDP growth compare in the 1940 to 2015 era, covered by Part 2 of the book? First, on many lists of improvements excluded from real GDP growth would come the changes in comfort, productivity, and geographical location made possible by the spread of air conditioning. Price indexes utterly failed to capture the value of the quantum leap in the quality of TV sets and the variety of entertainment available on them. Improvements in medical practice and scientific knowledge, particularly about the dangers of smoking, made possible continuing incremental improvements in life expectancy that were not valued by real GDP. Reductions in accident, motor vehicle, and air travel fatality rates continued unabated throughout the post-1940 period. Social changes, including civil rights legislation and the entry of women into the labor force and then into the professions, created unmeasured value of a different kind than that produced by running water and household appliances' creation of a transition away from female household tedium and drudgery. But in other respects, the extent of undervaluation of real GDP changes was less after 1970. Two aspects of the advance in the standard of living, the increased real quality of automobiles and the larger size of newly constructed housing units, were incorporated into real GDP with relative accuracy. After 1986, the price indexes used to create real GDP captured most, if not all, of the rapid improvement in the ratio of performance to price of mainframe and personal computers. Most of all, the extent by which growth in real GDP was understated became less important for a more basic reason: that the nature of change itself became less revolutionary after 1970 than in the special century that ended in 1970. Those who complain that real GDP and productivity statistics do not give credit to the multiple functions of the smartphone are correct as far as they go, but they often fail to realize that real GDP changes have understated progress since the beginning of recorded economic history, and for innovative changes far more important than the multifunction smartphone. The sources of faster and slower growth. Why was growth in labor productivity and in total factor productivity, TFP, so quick during 1920 to 70? Why did the pace of growth slow after 1970? Will future growth accelerate from the slow pace of the past decade, as is forecast by enthusiasts, whom we will collectively label the techno-optimists? Or is future growth more likely to resemble the disappointments of the recent past? There is no shortage of big questions, each of enormous importance. The chapters of Part 3 provide a set of suggestions and speculations intended to inform the debate and advance the discussion. Chapter 16 looks into the past rather than the future. It probes into the underlying data on labor and capital input and on TFP to provide a striking portrayal of economic progress. Not only was TFP growth much more rapid during the half-century 1920 to 70 than it had been before or has been since, but within those 50 years, the growth of TFP by decade steadily sped up from the 1920s to 1930s to a peak in the 1940s, followed by a symmetric downward series of steps into the decades of the 1950s, 1960s, and 1970s and beyond. There was a leap in TFP between 1929 and 1950 as real GDP more than doubled, even as labor and especially capital input grew far less rapidly. Our search for an explanation centers on the timing and magnitude of the Great Depression and World War II, both of which caused the inventions of the Second Industrial Revolution, particularly electric motors and assembly line methods, to have their full effect on productivity years earlier than might have otherwise occurred. In Chapter 17, the question shifts from why growth was so rapid before 1970 to why it has slowed since 1970. The basic answer is provided by the underlying distinction between the industrial revolutions. The utter change in everyday life made possible by the inventions of IR number 2 occurred in the special century between 1870 and 1970. But by that year, their main effects had already taken place. Unlike IR number 2, the digital revolution IR number 3 had a less powerful overall effect on productivity growth, and the main effect of its inventions occurred in the relatively short interval of 1996 to 2004, when the invention of the Internet, web browsers, search engines, and e-commerce created a fundamental change in business practices and procedures that was reflected in a temporary revival of productivity growth. The core of Chapter 17 demonstrates that the late 1990s represented a temporary, rather than a permanent, upswing in the pace of progress. The most recent decade, 2004 to 14, has been characterized by the slowest growth in productivity of any decade in American history, and this verdict of the productivity data is echoed by continuity rather than change in business practices in the worlds of offices, retail stores, hospitals, schools, universities, and the financial sector. In short, the changes created by the Internet revolution were sweeping, but were largely completed by 2005. The major exception, the invention and dissemination of the smartphone, has thus far not had a visible effect on the productivity data, as did the Internet revolution of the late 1990s. Chapter 17 concludes that the effect on productivity growth of innovation over the next 25 years will resemble that achieved within the last decade. That is, slower than during the 1995 to 2004 revival decade, but by no means negligible. In contrast, Chapter 18 strikes a more pessimistic note about the prognosis for the future of the standard of living based on the power of gale force headwinds that are currently operating to slow the growth of the standard of living for the majority of Americans. First among the headwinds is increased inequality. Fundamental changes in the American economy began in the late 1970s to create a steady multi-decade increase in the share of total income earned by the top 1% of the income distribution. Causes of faster income growth at the top include the superstar effect for compensation of sports and entertainment stars, a winner-take-all syndrome, enriching those perceived as being the best in the professions, and a sharp increase in the ratio of the pay of top business executives relative to average employee pay. Forces pushing down incomes in the middle and the bottom include the shrinking role of labor unions, the declining real value of the minimum wage, and the combined roles of automation and globalization in shrinking the availability of well-paying middle-income blue-collar and white-collar jobs. Growing inequality implies that whatever may be the growth rate of real income per person for the economy as a whole, the growth rate for the bottom 99% of the income distribution will be substantially slower. Other headwinds are also explored in Chapter 18. The historic role of rising educational attainment as a creator of productivity growth began to fade after 1970, when completion of high school reached a plateau of 75% to 80%. Though the four-year college completion rate continues to rise slowly, increasing numbers of college graduates face a dearth of available jobs that require a college education. Though on average college completion still pays off in higher lifetime incomes and a lower incidence of unemployment, despite the rising incidence of college debt, not everyone is average. Those who major in subjects not having a ready job market, or who take substantially longer than 4 years to complete the degree, can encounter a problematic future in which the rewards of a college degree do not balance the debt incurred to obtain it. Taken together, these forces combine in the educational headwind, the failure of rising educational attainment to make its historic contribution to productivity growth. Any force that holds back future productivity growth also has a similar effect on growth in output per person, for the two grow at identical rates if hours of work per person remain constant. But after rising, thanks to female labor force entry between the mid-1960s and late 1990s, the trend in hours per person shifted sign from growth to shrinkage after the year 2000. As a result of this decline in hours per person, which we label the demographic headwind, the growth of output per person has been slower than that of productivity. The labor force participation of prime-aged 25 to 54 men and women has declined since 2000, and since 2008, the overall labor force participation rate has begun to decline further as a result of retirement of the baby boom generation. This headwind will continue to hold down the growth of output per person over the next 2 decades. A final fiscal headwind is ahead, thanks to the inevitable future increase in the ratio of federal government debt relative to GDP over the next 2 decades, if current entitlement and tax policies continue. Some combination of benefit reductions and tax increases must be enacted by then, which will reduce the future growth of disposable personal income. Adding to the force of the headwinds are adverse sociological trends, particularly the decline of marriage as an institution, leading to the prediction that the increasing fraction of children growing up in single-parent households will be more likely to drop out of high school and engage in criminal activity. Chapter 18 concludes that this combination of 4 headwinds, inequality, education, demographic, and fiscal, will combine to imply future growth in the disposable income of the bottom 99% of the income distribution that is likely to be barely positive and substantially slower than growth in the labor productivity of the total economy. Because these sources of slower growth are deep-seated and have sources that extend back for decades, solutions to achieve faster growth are difficult to devise and are inevitably controversial. The book concludes with a postscript mini-chapter that outlines some of the policy directions that seem most likely to be fruitful. Part 3. The Sources of Faster and Slower Growth.
Please subscribe and press the bell icon to never miss another update. Please like, share and comment.